So when we say that we want women empowerment, we're not saying that we're trying to take away from what men have. What we're saying is that women should also have the same opportunities. If I want my daughter to be the CEO of Google, she should be able to have that opportunity, and she should be able to see a clearly defined career trajectory to that goal and to that point. Now, does that mean that men are better leaders? Like, I think that's a question I would love your followers to kind of ponder about and think about and reflect on. I would challenge that notion that men are better leaders and so they end up in those positions. I think what we'll find out if you kind of dig in a little more is that we've set up a structure, we've set up a system where the path is not so clear for women to climb up those corporate ladders and those career ladders. And women experience more challenges. You know, they may deal with gender bias at work. They may deal with sexism at work. Maybe women are not being promoted at the same rate as men because of how people feel about, you know, women being leaders. And those are like prejudiced beliefs and not necessarily how women act as leaders, because each individual woman is going to function differently in a leadership position. But just as a society as a whole, we have these common misconceptions about how a woman in a leadership position is going to act based on emotions. There's a country right now who has a female prime minister, right? And I think that's a clear example that women are good leaders. So if you have a daughter, this is an issue that should be of concern to you, because you do not want your daughter to have limited access to opportunities just because she was born a girl.
Hello. Welcome to another episode of Lost Lagosians, a podcast covering topics about Lagosians, Nigerians, and Africans in and out of Africa. I'm your host, Brodda Mike. Thank you guys for being here. If you find any value in this podcast or in these conversations, please do not forget to share with your loved ones. So also, if you can leave us a review on Apple iTunes, if you can leave us a review on Overcast or Stitcher, that would be really, really appreciated. Before we move forward, I also wanted to point out that some of the questions asked might sound stupid to some of you, might sound ignorant. I just want you guys to know that those questions are questions that were submitted by listeners of the show. Some of them are questions submitted from Nigeria. So please be patient. It's just that people have different views and a wide range of opinions about this topic. I myself am a self-declared feminist. So it's just we need to have these conversations, and sometimes the questions might be questions you don't expect, or they might be like ignorant questions. So please bear with us, and just really hope you guys enjoy this episode and take a thing or two out of it. So again, I really want to say special thanks to Dr. Toyin for being here. She's been very, very generous with her time, even though I thought that a lot of professors generally in the summer, they will have a lighter schedule. She was with us on episode 47. That episode was titled African Immigrant Privilege. What an honor to have you again. Thank you for being here, ma'am. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Brodda Mike. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so again, my thought was that the summer you guys did nothing but just, traveled over the world. But boy, was I wrong.
Yes, I think that's a common misconception, but no, we're busy, we're writing grants, we're looking for opportunities for funding and just doing other things. Course writing, there's a lot to be done over summer.
Yeah, I know those in academia, like sometimes they say they take that job because they only work 9 months in a year. But as I've been talking to you and as I kind of looked more into that, it turns out that those in academia actually, for the most part, it's all year round.
Absolutely. Yes, it is.
So what I wanted to talk to you about today was about the perception in the African community, specifically Africans and also African American community, where it's mostly male dominated, and the saying in America is men like women to be pregnant with no shoes on and stuff like that. So that's something that I have grown up with, being Nigerian, and I'm sure you have to an extent, where the male role is always praised, or it's given like a different level, I guess. So this conversation is timely in light of the Roe v. Wade decision, by the Supreme Court. We saw the draft of those. And so then also there's the women movement and feminism and all. So it's a pretty loaded conversation. I feel like I'm a minority here talking to you. You know what's going on. So in a way, while I might sound like an ignoramus, I'm also looking forward to be educated. So please excuse my ignorant or dumb male questions if you can.
Yeah,
but what would you define feminism, though, like a 101, if you had to kind of jump into that?
Yeah, so I think feminism in its most basic form, it's a movement that's advocating for women's rights. It's advocating for women to have access to equitable opportunities, equitable protections, equitable resources, similar to what men have. I know the term feminism is a loaded term within the African community, and that's because we come from a patriarchal culture. So we come from a culture where men they hold the most power, right? And I think when people think feminism, they think, women dominated, female dominated kind of social structure. And that's not really what feminism is. I think that's a common misconception within the African community, that feminism is in conflict and doesn't align well with our patriarchal social structure. And I think in order for you to really understand what feminism is, you kind of have to be open. You have to learn more about what does the feminist movement want? What are they advocating for? In its most basic form, we really just want women to have access to the same opportunities. We want to make sure that women have choices, that women have a seat at the proverbial tables, to make sure that they have access to resources, to opportunities, and to the same protections that men have in society. So that's basically, in its simplest form, how I would define feminism.
So feminism for an African guy is basically women want to be men, right?
Now, that's the misconception. Women do not want to be men. Women just we want to live in a society where, we have equitable access to resources that I can apply.
I'm sorry, as expected here, big grammar. Patriarchy, equitable. So patriarchy basically is the man, the man society, men own everything. I think I know what that is. But equitable, what would that mean for like an African definition?
So I think, a simple sort of like synonym, it's not the same, but equal. So we want to have equal access to opportunities.
Yeah, that's what I said, though, that women want to be men. And you said that's not what it is.
No, because I think what you're saying is, what do you mean by when you say women want to be men? In what regard? I think maybe if you elaborate on that, I can respond to that. What does that mean for you?
It's like, God, you're putting me on the spot here. Let me give you an example. It may not be a great example, but it's like all things that fly has wings, but not all things that have wings can fly. Okay. So what that example basically is that, like, you think about things like, let's say there are certain things that may be designed to have a wing, but they can't necessarily fly. Before you can fly, you need to understand aerodynamics of flight. Bernoulli's theory, there's some physics behind thrust and lift. So you can design something that has wings, but the original conception will be, well, all things that have wings should be able to fly. So when the Wright brothers were designing planes, they're like, okay, if the birds fly, so birds must have wings. So let's have the plane have wings. But the plane wouldn't fly because you have helicopters that fly. They don't have wings like, birds do. So back to your question, though, like, women want to be equal to men, but it doesn't necessarily mean that women want to be equal. I think there's a fine line between that definition, which gets myself and a lot of men tripped up. And that goes back to my analogy I was making earlier. There are some things that are necessary to distinguish between feminism and women equality. So women might say feminism is like, oh, we don't want to be men. But how would you be able to differentiate? There's a fine line, like there are a lot of nuances in between that makes men tripped up.
Okay. So I think in order to understand what feminism is, what women empowerment movement really is advocating for, or what are the goals of that movement is, we have to start from some of the basic facts and like what are the gaps that this kind of movement, feminism, women empowerment, are trying to address. So some of the basic truths, and these are like global truths across different global contexts, is that globally, women are overrepresented in the global population of people living in poverty, of people who experience hunger, of people who are illiterate, of people who experience violence, sexual violence, intimate partner violence. So
Because they're
there's a,
weaker.
it's not because they're weaker, but it's just how society has been socialized, is that women, just based on how society is socialized and based on the male socialization and what we expect a masculine person to be, masculine or male people tend to act out in ways that are violent, when they're angry, just because that's what we expect boys to do, is um, to express anger in the form of aggression. Now, that's a whole different topic. When we talk about like women violence and why women experience violence at a disproportionate rate, that's like a very complex topic. It's very different. There are a lot of factors that contribute to that. But when we look across the board and we look at a lot of these social and health disparities that women are overrepresented in, that's a sign that there is a structural problem here. So there is some underlying issues here that needs to be addressed. And that's what really feminism is trying to get at the root of, is how do we unpack some of these issues? How do we go to the root source of these issues and make sure that women are protected in society, make sure that women have access to education? First of all, that's an important factor when we talk about lifetime earnings, when we talk about power, when we talk about opportunities. We live in a society where in some countries, girls do not go to school. They do not have access to education because they were born a girl child. And that's just, people use culture as a way to like justify those kinds of practices. But when we live in a society that's still the norm in some cultures, that's a problem. And I think that's what women empowerment movements and feminism really is trying to get to the root of, is how do we solve some of these issues? How do we make sure that women globally have access to education, to employment? I mean, we have to acknowledge that there is still in 2022 a gender equity pay gap. Women are getting paid less for the same work that men are doing.
Well, there's the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and then there's the Lilly-led Better Pay Act of 2009 that Obama signed into law. I think that might have been one of the first things he signed into law, from what I remember. And that was just trying to equalize the pay gap in federal jobs. People do understand that women, I think it's to like 75 cents to every dollar, something like that. Don't quote me on that. To every dollar that a man makes is 75 cents. But so I hear you loud and clear because I'm familiar with the statistics. I know that's true. But if we wanted to narrow this is a very big topic we're trying to address here. And I don't feel like, I think starting off, you are hitting a lot of like points and stuff, which is good. But for our audience who are mostly African American or African descent, can we try to, in a way, narrow it down so that it will be more applicable to the audience? Because there are a lot of things. So you are talking about things like girl child education, or girls don't go to school. That's true, but not in all cases in terms of location. In America, girls have the same access as boys do. I would even argue that more girls are educated, more girls are enrolled in college. Girls do better in elementary to K through 8. Kindergarten through 8th grade. Girls do better statistically because at that age, girls pay more attention than boys do. But if we just make a comment and say, well, girls don't go to school, but, it's true, but it's too different. Kind of like if it's like in a Islamic religion-based area, I can see that because there's the Sharia law. So what I'm trying to say is to, like, if we can pick one and narrow things, then I think we have a more interesting way of being able to find a solution. Our goal here is to solve the inequality problem. If we can achieve that, I think, we'll have done a lot, even though I'm saying that tongue in cheek. But go ahead, what's your response to that?
So that is hard. It's hard to pick one issue because feminism is not, it's not just about what is the one issue. There is no globally, all the issues are pressing issues. But yeah, I get what you mean that,
Mhm.
the fact that a girl child in Nigeria is not going to school is may be a distant reality for those of us who are in the US and who have
Mhm.
access to education and all that. So what are maybe the pressing issues for women in the diaspora, for African individuals or people of African descent in the diaspora? Maybe things like violence against women. Women still
Mhm.
experience rape violence at a
Mhm.
higher rate compared to men, and that's just a reality. We don't have policies and practices, societal practices that gives women proper legal recourse in a consistent way whenever they experience gender-based violence like rape or intimate partner violence. Yeah, I know there are people that think that US has a really good justice system that really protects women. But if you listen to some of the data, you kind of pay attention to some of the data, you listen to some of women's experiences, which I've done because I actually conduct women's health research, we'll
Mhm.
find out that there are inconsistencies in how women are protected, especially when they're victims of rape or sexual violence.
But men don't have like a men's domestic violence hotline or men domestic violence center. If a man got, well, let me take that back. Men may have that, but not as much as women do. So, for example, there might be one center in Seattle, Washington for a guy, if he's lucky to find one, and there might be 20 for women. So it's disproportionately affecting men in that regard because the society have admitted, to your point, that women get more abused, women get more raped, women
Mhm.
get more domestic violence issues. So I guess my point is, men could also make those cases you are making, couldn't
No,
they?
they cannot. No, because
They cannot.
domestic violence and rape disproportionately impacts women. And that's just based on data, it's based on evidence. Of course, if that's the fact, if that's the case, that is where we're going to allocate most of our resources. Now, I don't know the data off the top of my head about the demographics and what percentages of men are victims of physical abuse or domestic violence, rape. It does happen. There are men who are victims of violence, and that's unfortunate, and that's a problem in itself, and that needs to be addressed, and there needs to be resources for men, and society needs to also understand that that happens to men, and that we're not further victimizing men who experience violence, because I think that's something that happens is, when a man is raped, it's like, how does that happen? You're so weak, and they're demeaned rather than supported, and that's a totally different issue. But if we're talking about, why more resources are not allocated to men who do experience violence, that's because women experience violence at a significantly higher rate, yes, compared to men.
Are you familiar with Chimamanda Adichie, the
Yes, absolutely.
self-proclaimed Nigerian feminist?
Hmm.
So she also advocates a lot of this. And what I'm wondering is, I've not seen her like in a debate in a way to explain her stance or to explain in a very heated debate. A lot of the videos I've watched or the documentaries or commentaries about her that she'd given. In fact, she was in Portland before the pandemic, and I got an opportunity to go see her. A lot of the places where she's placed herself is places where she's not been challenged. So if you guys look online and kind of see some of her interviews and stuff, they always give her this like red carpet. What I'm just trying to say is that in the African society, men are still considered superior to women vis-a-vis the culture. Culture defines this role. So I'm just trying to say that men should not be blamed for being superior in Africa, for example, in other parts like in the Middle East, for example. It's just the religion, the culture. How much of that would you say is a factor in contributing to the role of anti-feminist movements, if you want to say that?
So I think once again, that's another misconception is this belief that feminism is what's the word? It's anti-male. And feminism is saying that men are evil and men are the problem. Men are not the problem. The problem is the structure that we have set up. The problem is the commonly accepted practices, it's policy that doesn't protect women. So when we say that we want women empowerment, we're not saying that in that we're trying to take away from what men have. What we're saying is that women should also have the same opportunities. If I want my daughter to be the CEO of Google, she should be able to have that opportunity and she should be able to see a clearly defined career trajectory to that goal and to that point. But if you look across the board at a lot of the executive positions, the leadership positions across the United States, so when you ask the question about how is this related to people's experiences in the US? If you look at the people who fill up these leadership positions across the US, it is predominantly men. Now, does that mean that men are better leaders? Like, I think that's a question I would love your followers to kind of ponder about and think about and reflect on. I would challenge that notion that men are better leaders and so they end up in those positions. I think what we'll find out if you kind of dig in a little more is that we've set up a structure, we've set up a system where the path is not so clear for women to climb up those corporate ladders and those career ladders. And women experience more challenges. They may deal with gender bias at work. They may deal with sexism at work. Maybe women are not being promoted at the same rate as men because of how people feel about, women being leaders. And those are like prejudiced beliefs and not necessarily how women act as leaders, because each individual woman is going to function differently in a leadership position. But just as a society as a whole, we have these common misconceptions about how a woman in a leadership position is going to act based on emotions. It's some of the things I've heard based on the evidence. But if you look at, there's a country right now who has a female prime minister, I believe it's New Zealand.
Oh, yeah, New Zealand does.
Yes, yes. And I've read a lot about that prime minister. She's doing really amazing work, very knowledgeable, very well loved by the people in her country. And I think that's a clear example that women are good leaders, and we really just need a clear pathway to make it up that ladder. And we also need opportunities to have a seat at the table. So how do we get women to these positions? How do we define a pathway and remove some of those hurdles for women so that they can also have access to the same opportunities? And one thing I would love to say to your listeners is, this is not just a women's issue. I believe strongly that this is a human rights issue. So if you have a daughter, this is an issue that should be of concern to you, because you do not want your daughter to have limited access to opportunities just because she was born a girl. And I'm also a believer that what's local is global, and what's global is also local. So what's happening in Nigeria impacts in some way is going to impact us in the US. So I think what's happening globally in other countries to girls and to women really should also be of concern to us as well.
Yeah, and that's evident by the Chibok girls, Bring Back Our Girls, the rally from a couple years ago. So yeah, I agree with that. So the United Nations, part of their goal for sustainable development, one of them is regarding gender equality. The United Nations aims to achieve gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls. As of right now, no country is on track to achieve this goal by 2030. So I do agree with you to an extent. Not completely. Not completely. I've not been sold yet. And some of our listeners might not have been sold yet. So hopefully we can be able to dig a little bit deeper. So primarily, my other question for you is why is it not called like humanism? Primarily, what you are describing as feminism is just, shouldn't that be like called humanism? Humanism is where like all humans are treated equally, which bring all the other elements like the racial disparities, anti-Semitism, black, whites, and all that, those kind of stuff. Why is the matter of feminism? Why is that considered higher than other social injustice, like Black Lives Matters? Why should feminism be taken more seriously or be considered higher than other issues, because I think those in my mind will probably, slavery is bad. I know we all condemn slavery, but there's still racism that maltreat black people. So I don't know if you get my question.
Yeah. So I don't think there's anyone who's saying that feminism should take precedence over other social movements. So all social movements that are centered on social justice and basic human rights for marginalized communities and marginalized people, they can coexist. So we can tackle racism and we can tackle gender equity issues at the same time. We can do all those things concurrently. And I don't think they are mutually exclusive movements, and no one is saying that one should take precedence or one is more important than the other. So there's actually another kind of like in research in critical, so I don't want to use terminology that's kind of foreign to your listeners, but in research, in academia, there's this term called intersectionality. So intersectionality acknowledges that for a lot of women of color, we're not just dealing with the struggles of being a woman, you're also dealing with the struggles of being whatever ethnicity or racial identity you have, whatever class or socioeconomic status you belong to. So there are a lot of different identities that can cause challenges for people on a daily basis. So a lot of those identities intersect and they influence each other. So one, it's really hard to separate one from the other. So both or all these social movements can totally coexist, and they should be all tackled and addressed at the same time.
We should tackle everything at the same time. Yeah, I get that. But if you focus on places like India or say Saudi Arabia and unfortunately Nigeria, there's still this that goes back to my question earlier about the culture and the role of culture. I agree with you. Men and women should be treated equally. I agree with you on that. I do not agree that men and women are equal in terms of their gender roles, because men were built differently and women were also built differently. And the military is a good place where this has been demonstrated, where they try to integrate women into certain tasks, and women couldn't do as well as men. Of course, you have the exceptional 1% that always does even better than men, but for the vast majority, men and women are built differently. Their anatomy, their physiology. Also, if you look at medical research, there are certain anatomical differences, and you know all about this more than I would ever do. But there are certain drugs that were administered that are only tested in men. There are certain procedures that are tested in men only, and that has to do with the women and being, the bearer of children and stuff like that. So from a biological and anatomical perspective, men and women are definitely not the same. And that's what trips a lot of people up, myself included.
I don't think anyone is saying men and women are the same, though. We're just saying men and women should have access to the same resources. So I think the question I would like for your listeners to kind of ponder on is, should my biological sex determine whether or not I should be the CEO of Google if that's what I aspire to be? Should my biological sex determine whether or not I get to own property? So there are countries and cultures, some in Nigeria actually, where women cannot own landed assets. They can't own property. It has to be in their husband's name. So should my biological sex determine whether I get to have assets in my name? Should my biological sex determine whether I get to have access to employment? So no one is saying that, men and women are the same. That's not right. We are physiologically, biologically different. And that's just reality. That's how God created us. But should those physical, biological differences determine our access to opportunities and resources? And I think that's the question that begs to be answered.
If I can try to answer that, Doctor. So what you're saying is that women deals with stress on the same level as men does. So basically a high stress job. Now, on a side note, here in the States and most part of the Western world, you can actually change your sex. So with that aside, let's say you don't change your sex with any kind of sex drug or sex surgery or whatever. Let's say we keep our original sexes at birth. Stress, going back to my comment about stress. are you saying that women can handle stress equally as men can? Because those jobs you're talking about, the CEOs and the 1% jobs that we want women to be in, we are claiming that women should have equal access to. A lot of them are actually quite stressful. So are you saying that women can handle stress? Because I know that women deal with stress differently as men can, and there's some positions like in the military. Again, I keep going back to military. There are some decisions that only men can take. And what they found in the military is that because women have like a cycle and the period and what stuff like that might impact the decisions in terms of stress management. So how do you address that? I mean, those are things that some people are probably thinking about that we also need to bring to the forefront.
Yeah, I would say that's all pseudoscience that needs to be critiqued. Yes, that needs to be seriously critiqued, because as far as I know, there is no reliable evidence that shows that the stress tolerance level for men and men are significantly different. That does not, it just doesn't add up to me. But so I think
But women do have hormonal swings and situations like that
yeah,
naturally occur based on the cycle, and that's nature. We can't.
But that doesn't relate to stress tolerance though. So I would like your listeners to kind of ponder on the role of their mothers in raising children at home. Women in their traditional roles are OGs at multitasking. Like, we are really the MVPs at multitasking. A lot of women who are stay-at-home moms are juggling childcare, home-taking activities, getting children to multiple places. If you think about what it means to be a mother, that is a role that's like the epitome of multitasking and juggling multiple things at the same time. And that's just what society expects women to do in that traditional role of being a wife and a mother. So if, based on that experience, if someone would ask me if women can tolerate stress, my answer to that would be an emphatic yes. And I would ask your listeners once again, maybe who are wives and mothers, leave your husband with your 4 children for a week and just go on vacation and just see how that experience goes for him and how he handles the stress of being in that caretaking role by himself. It's a different experience for men when they're left in that caretaking role by themselves. So there is no clear evidence to me that the stress tolerance level for women and men are different. So I'm not buying that.
Here's what I would say to that. Here's what I have to say to that. You are a researcher, you're an academician, you need facts, you need hard science and hard facts. Unfortunately, science, there are some things there's no scientific data on, and the results might not be conclusive. So we may never be able to get that fact or that data or that science. Maybe there's one out there that we've not uncovered yet. So I'll give that to you. What I just wanted to say is that women are built naturally to care for their children, is their maternal instinct, as well as men who are built to provide and be a provider. That's the African in me that is talking about this.
Yes, that is the African in you, because there is no gene, there's no child caring gene, and there's no provider gene. So once again, this is us internalizing ideas from our cultural socialization, which is okay. Everyone has a right to have certain cultural values and certain beliefs, but that's not a biological difference. That's a social norm. Those are based on social traditions.